I have to apologize right off the bat for the amphibians in my throat today. I guess I should not have ridden in that horseless carriage last evening with the top down after all. But my brother Joe insisted I take a ride, and he's the brave one in the family. So here I am today. I will do my best in speaking to this wonderful group of neighbors and friends who have joined me here today on this very spring-like afternoon in April of 1911. Oh my, could it be 30 years, almost 30 years, since that fateful day in the Washington train station? I'm guessing that many of you have not heard very much about me since my husband's passing. Even the newspapers have called me the vanishing First Lady and discreet Crete. But I assure you I have had a very busy life, even though it was a quiet one since my husband's death. The subscription fund that was raised by Cyrus Field when my husband was assassinated has provided me with the ability to do three very important things. First of all, to raise our 5 children. You know, the oldest was only about 19 when their papa died. The youngest was 9. So I'm so pleased to tell you that they have all been well educated by now. They're married and have homes and children of their own. Secondly, I was able to retain my mentor farm and improve things over the years, making it more into a country estate and a family compound. The third thing, and maybe most precious to my heart in some ways, is that I have been able to preserve my husband's memory. He was only president for 6 months. Half of that was on his sickbed. When he died, he had many papers, a vast amount of correspondence. He had school and college notebooks. He had newspaper clippings, telegrams, his daily diary. These were usually stored at our homes, both in Washington at our 13th and I Street house and here in Ohio. And you can imagine how this group of papers and books increased during his presidential front porch campaign in 1880 and during his presidency and assassination the following year. Papers, papers. I believe that my husband was inspired to save things from an early visit he made to the John Adams family compound in Quincy, Massachusetts in July of 1869. He so relished being in that old structure where several generations of the Adams family had lived. He saw their papers, the books, the architecture, the stories of that old home, the artwork. And during that visit, he wrote a lengthy letter to me that I brought today. It's over on the table there. And near the end of it, he said, "Do you think our children will one day want to uncover our letters and read our letters? Those that I wrote to you and you wrote to me?" But I think that's when he really started to save things in earnest. And he saved everything, as I mentioned. When I had to leave the executive mansion, I entrusted those papers to the Treasury Department for safekeeping until we could sort them, arrange them, process all these many papers, because the Treasury Department had a fireproof room that would keep them safely under wraps. Thus began a very cherished and important project for our family, building a memorial library. My 2 oldest sons were very actively involved. Hal arranged books and even created a card catalog. Second son Jim spent hours with papers and slips and receipts, arranging things alphabetically. And my future son-in-law, Joseph Stanley Brown, was very vital to this project. Now I know some people say Joseph is too aggressive, he's pushy, he has too many grand ideas, he's overconfident for a 20-something-year-old. And it's true. Those are all true things about him. But I also see him as a creative young man with grand ideas. And so I entrusted him with the care and the arranging of my husband's papers. He spent the next couple years going through huge crates that my husband had constructed, rope handles, very heavy duty, to hold his papers, hundreds of items. Sometimes Joseph enlisted my husband's good friends to help him with some of the correspondence or tracking down a reply to a letter that was not in the collection. So Burke Hinsdale was called upon, Colonel Rockwell, David Swaim, longtime friends of my husband. Why, Joseph even had a fireproof room built at his home in Washington on Massachusetts Avenue, complete with a security alarm. So over the next few years, he was immersed in this project, while he was employed full-time with General Powell and the U.S. Geological Survey. Can you imagine? This young man worked all day, came home, spent his off hours and his weekends going through my husband's papers and meticulously arranging them. Eventually, he did have to hire a couple of young men to assist with the project, or we'd still be waiting for that to be completed, I think. But you know, this was a very tricky thing because Joseph was very wary that a servant or one of these young men would steal papers and try to sell them for money, or perhaps there would be an accidental fire that would destroy these important items. He said he could vouch for these two young men, and he hired them part-time, and they would almost babysit the papers there at that fireproof room that was alarmed. During that time, Joseph and I corresponded pretty frequently, and he was not shy about giving me his opinions and suggestions. But he did ask for my advice as well. But many times we went back and forth on what the library should be made out of. He suggested brick and stone to be as fireproof as possible. He said it should be at the back of the dining room area of the house, most likely. He even sent designs of what it should look like. And enclosed in many of those letters were little items for my daughter Molly. Poems that Joseph wrote, drawings that he made, little notes to her, for they were quite interested in one another. So finally, after several years, Joseph says to me, I believe I'm going to have the project finished during the summer of 1885, including having the papers bound. When the first batch was returned to him, he was hugely disappointed because the binding wasn't what he had expected. So he went to a second bindery where he knew that they would look handsome, dignified, professional. Now I had to get busy with constructing a place for these papers here in Mentor. So I hired an architect from Cleveland, Forrest Coburn, in the summer of 1885 to help me in designing this space that we would create that included a library, a place for my husband's books and papers. Some of you may remember Forrest Coburn actually built the catafalque that was in Public Square where my husband was laid for the public for several days in a row. We went back and forth on ideas. We talked about building this at the back of the house. We my idea is to keep the cottage, the farmhouse that my husband knew and loved, at the forefront. That this addition was going to be behind the house. It was going to be at the back of the house. Subservient, basically, to the farmhouse that my husband knew. And we all agreed it had to be including some brick and some stonework to be fireproof as possible. The addition almost doubled the square footage of my farmhouse. But it had ample space for a lovely memorial library and a place for my husband's papers. The two older boys also even helped with tearing out the back of the house and helping take out the kitchen. Now, originally, the architect suggested that we build the library on the first floor. But after much discussion, it was decided that if we raised it up a bit, it would be a little more secure, and it would have its own place between the first and second floor of the farmhouse. So we all came to that agreement. And that construction took place from the summer of 1885 through 86. Now, ladies, when your kitchen's torn out of your home, the best thing is to relocate. Don't you agree? So some of you may not know, but I actually lived in Cleveland while all of this construction was occurring. All the dust and the tear out and the rebuild going on while I was in Cleveland on Prospect, close to 40th Street. But every day I would come out and the family would superintend this project. The memorial library was set up with my husband's books, about 2,000 volumes, all placed around the perimeter in bookshelves. And Hal and Jim found that to be a favorite job of theirs, arranging their father's books. The room also was slated to contain funeral obsequies and memorial items that people had sent to us from around the world, like a photograph of Queen Victoria. There's also some lovely artwork, especially men that my husband knew and admired, all placed around the walls. In the northeast corner, I devoted that space as a mourning nook, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. The Carrera marble bust was made by Preston Powers. We have it draped with the black cloth of mourning. And when my mother-in-law saw this bust of her son, she wept because she thought it was such a good likeness of him. The opposite corner, the northwest corner, would be devoted to a fireproof, theft-proof vault. Concrete walls with brick outside, and outside of that, sandstone. That's why you see sandstone on the back of the house here. All to be as fireproof as possible. And within this room, which I called the memory room, and someone's saying, turn the picture. All right, that makes sense. Sorry, everyone is looking like this. Concrete walls. Within the room, the many volumes of bound papers that Joseph Stanley Brown worked so hard on. Some funeral relics here too, like this white tuberose wreath that was sent on behalf of Queen Victoria and the British nation. There are some pieces of wood that have been carved into items. Those came from the catafalque that Mr. Garfield was laid upon in Public Square. Double steel doors as the entrance to this room. I have such a peace of mind every evening when I close those doors and lock them like a combination safe, for I know they are protected from fire and theft in this room. And here's a picture of those many volumes. You can see that Joseph had them very meticulously organized, different colors denoting different categories. They filled up the cabinets, they filled up the bookshelves. Over 400 volumes. Many, many, many papers. Now, the importance of these papers and keeping them, I think I feel the same as my husband about that. Because we are saving them for posterity, for our children and their spouses, and also our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren and future generations. In fact, on special occasions, I slowly unlock those metal doors and open them for the grandchildren. Their eyes get huge. And they say, "Grandmama, we smell the musty papers that belong to our famous grandfather." It also preserves the inside story of Mr. Garfield's public life, but also his private life and mine as well. Did you know that he and I shared over 1,200 letters? But I recall the very first one that he sent like it was yesterday. "My dear Lucretia, pardon the liberty I take in pointing my pen your direction this evening, for I have seen so much scenery that I cannot contain it all myself." He was heading east to Massachusetts in 1853 and wrote that very first letter to me. Do you know what he had seen? Niagara Falls. Yes, my friends from the Garfield site, Niagara Falls. Imagine him seeing that grand cataract and wanting to share those experiences with me. So that began not only letter writing, but I guess you could say an official courtship, because you ladies know as soon as a gentleman writes to you, all of your family and friends think that you're about to be engaged. So that began the official relationship that we had. He also wrote home during his absence while he was at the battlefront during the Civil War, writing to friends and family and associates, sometimes sending letters saying, "I haven't heard anything from home for weeks. I need a letter." Would you indulge me if I read a couple of excerpts from letters that he wrote home during that time? I pulled them aside just in case you said yes. The first one is early in his career in the Army, from Camp Chase, August 22nd, 1861. "Your good letter," he says, "dear Crete, your good letter was received Saturday night, and the trunk came at the same time. I was thankful for the many comforts you had enclosed in the trunk. I find them all coming in play. I think I have no unmanly feelings in regard to the future and my own place in it. But I have more sadness at the thought that should anything befall me, Trot would not remember me." Trot was our little toddler at the time, our little daughter, too young to remember her father if something drastic happened. I know how a child feels under such circumstances, and that by experience. Since I began this letter, I probably have given 100 orders. Among other things, I held a trial, sentenced a sentinel to a 3-day imprisonment on bread and water for sleeping on his post. Kiss Trot for me and get her finger marks on your next letter in some way if you can. Ever yours and hers, James. Then I received a very vivid letter in January of 1862, one of his first battles. "My dear Crete, from Paintsville, Kentucky. You have doubtless heard before that we have had a battle with the enemy. I have just returned from Prestonsburg and now find my first breathing space since we left this place. I will endeavor to give you a history of the whole affair. During Saturday and Sunday, I planned and conducted a series of little maneuvers intended to mislead the enemy in regard to my own intentions. I believe I was entirely successful, and someday I hope to tell you all about them in detail. On Tuesday, we moved up the dark gorge with cannon, throwing forward pickets and scouts, and at 8 o'clock entered the deserted fortifications of the rebels, where their campfires were still smoldering, and the scattered remnant of their stores lay in sad confusion. The frozen tracks of thousands of feet were plain under the light of the new moon. While sitting in the deserted house, which had been General Marshall's headquarters, the rebels' headquarters, I received a dispatch from a messenger saying that the enemy's cavalry were in full at the mouth of Jenny's Creek, that our cavalry had skirmished with them. I marched on and built 2 bridges that night and reached Paintsville just as the sun was rising. It was the hardest march I have ever made. The next day was spent in scouting to learn the route the enemy had taken. I found the river was up, it had risen, so that the enemy could not cross to take the road to Piketon. He had turned southwestward and was retreating up a branch of Jenny's Creek. Such was the terrible state of the roads and the exceeding depth of mud that our supplies had come up very slowly, and I could not for several days get provisions enough to warrant a pursuit with my whole force. We advanced and occupied the ridge, whose termination is called Graveyard Point. As we passed around the point, the enemy's cavalry was seen in the plain. Hardly a minute more had elapsed when boom went a cannon, followed by another throwing a 12-pound shell which struck within 2 feet of Adjutant Olds, who was leading the company of our scouts. The shell tore up the mud in the midst of the company but did not explode. Had it done so, it would have annihilated my entire company. Nearly all of Marshall's shells were duds. My reserve was now reduced to a mere handful, and the agony of the moment was terrible. The whole hill was enshrouded in such a volume of smoke as rose from the mouth of a volcano. Thousands of gun flashes leaped like lightning from the cloud. Every minute the fight grew hotter. In my agony of anxiety, I prayed to God for the reinforcements to appear. I was just ordering my whole reserve onto line and was going to lead them up the hill myself when I looked behind us and saw the Hiram banner sweep round the hill. I shouted to our boys, "Look!" They saw, and such a shout of joy never greeted my ears. I can never tell you how full of love and pride my heart is towards our Hiram boys. I have written this to be read to all our friends whom you think it will be well to be seen. I've had but 2 letters from you. Do let me hear from all of you. I've taken a secession flag and will bring it home with me. Ever truly yours, James. One last very poignant brief note that he wrote from Corinth, Mississippi on May 4th, 1862. My dear Crete, I sit by the rough desk in my tent to write again in the hope that this will reach you before May is gone. The past night and the morning thus far have been strangely quiet for the camp of a great army. There is the peculiar quiet and subdued manner which characterizes men who are on the eve of great events, in which their own lives are at stake. I rode alone in the woods this morning and saw little groups here and there, seated in the leaves in low, earnest conversations. Sometimes a little group with a Bible in their midst, sometimes a man by himself reading a pocket-worn letter. Men who are usually rough address each other with more than usual gentleness. All this tells me that these men will fight with great desperation. Give my love to all. Yours, James. Now, you may not know that prior to this time, the 1880s, a United States president's papers were considered private. They could do with them what they wished. They could donate them to universities, they could house them at home, they could burn them and ensure that they remained private. So in our case, I think it's really special that my husband wanted to preserve all of these things, the good and the bad. I've spent many hours within the effects of my husband's papers and books and things. You know, I'm hoping to write a biography, but I doubt I'm going to get the time. It's April of 1911 already. I don't know how much time I have left. So now I'm looking forward to meeting Professor Theodore Clark Smith of Williams College, my husband's alma mater. He's a history professor there, so I think I can trust him to get the story right, and I can help superintend the process, because up till now I have refused many people's attempt to ask for those papers and to use them for books, newspaper accounts. I'm just not trusting in what they will do with them. I've been told that this may be the very first presidential memorial library in the country, and that perhaps the idea will catch on and this could be a model for future libraries. That would please me. It would make me feel very good if someday my husband's papers were sent to the Congressional Library, the place that he and I went so often during our lives in Washington. We'll see what happens with those papers one day. I think that this library may be the most fitting memorial to my husband. I made the interior out of oak, warm golden oak, so that it would be an inviting space for our family to gather. And I want this to be worthy of my husband. Did you know that some of my husband's last words were, "Do you think my name will have a place in history?" I can say that by your attendance here today, that has come true. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm here for questions if you'd like to know anything more. Yes, sir.
Yes, was he the, let's see, Lincoln, 16, Johnson, was he the 19th president?
20th.
The 20th.
Mr. Hayes from Ohio was the 19th.
Oh,
He succeeded Mr. Hayes, and Mr. Grant was number 18, so we had 3 Ohioans in a row.
Okay, he was the 19th then. And I also heard, I saw a few years ago a documentary about Garfield, and had he not been assassinated, I think he would have pushed for equal rights for African Americans and other minorities.
He had several reforms in mind, and I believe he included the equal rights of freed slaves in his inaugural address.
Okay.
So from the very beginning, the very start of his administration, this was important to him. And so there are many what ifs, aren't there? With his life cut short at only 49 years old, we won't know how that would have transpired. Yes, sir. Other questions about anything? Yes, Barbara.
How did they get the mail?
How did they
Get their letters?
How did they get their letters? Well, it depended if it was wartime or if it was regular time. You know, Abraham Lincoln worked at a post office. And, you know, at that time, the recipient paid for the postage. So when you went to collect your mail, that's when you anteed up for your letters and things. And so by this time, we have some mails, but you don't have to put too much on your envelope. You can just write Lucretia Garfield, West Mentor, Ohio, and it will get to me. And Mr. Garfield also, because he was a congressman for 17 years, had free franking, which means he had free use of the postal service. And so that may have contributed to the vast number of letter writing that he did to constituents and fellow congressmen and other people that he rubbed elbows with. Yes, sir, Chris.
Joseph Stanley Brown do when he wasn't organizing the letters? What was his full-time job?
He was working with John Wesley Powell in the U.S. Geological Survey. He started out as a secretary to Mr. Powell. Joseph was a smart young man. He taught himself typewriting with a new convenience. He taught himself shorthand. So he was someone you wanted to hire. So he started out as a secretary, but then he went to the Yale Scientific School and became a geologist. And so he worked with the Geological Survey that way. He even got to spend time in Alaska on the Pribilof Islands. So he got to travel quite a bit with the Geological Survey and created what we call lantern slides and would give talks around the country about his work with the Geological Survey. Yes, sir.
As far as research, do you have people using the library for that?
Here in Mentor?
Yes.
Well, I will step out of character. As Debbie Weinkamer, who is the lead volunteer there, I can tell you that the papers are no longer housed at the Garfield site. They were there till the 1930s. And then the grown Garfield children began to donate them to the Library of Congress, as Lucretia and James may have hoped. And they went over in a number of batches. And I was preparing this talk, I read the provenance from the Library of Congress. And some of those letters took a long time to get there. And maybe wisely so, especially the private letters. The youngest son, Abram, asked that they be held for a certain length of time until all 5 of the Garfield children were deceased, so that these private letters wouldn't be something embarrassing the family, or just he was more comfortable with that notion. And he died in 1958. So the very last batch of them didn't go over there till the 1960s. So it was stretched out quite a bit. Starting in the 1930s, several large batches went over there, and then it concluded in the 1960s. It took a while to get all of that there. Yes, ma'am.
So did he read the letters that he thought there was something in the contents that would have been embarrassing to the family?
Oh yes, he knew.
Oh.
He knew, like I say, he saved everything. So he saved the good and the bad and the ugly. The idea was that he would tell his own children, or his own children would read these letters. They wouldn't have to hear it from some other source, which was important to him. So they got the story straight from James Garfield. One episode I can think of is he wrote a letter to Lucretia after seeing Abraham Lincoln at the State House in Columbus. Lincoln was going through on his way to the Executive Mansion in 1861. And James writes home to Crete that he saw Mrs. Lincoln, very homely, pug-nosed lady, short and squat. And he goes on about Mrs. Lincoln's appearance. And Lucretia chastised him in her reply that it was not his place to write about Mrs. Lincoln in that regard. So that's just a little example, but there were many things like that where he could speak his mind freely. And there were some scandals in his career as a congressman. He was never found guilty of anything important. It didn't keep him from becoming president. But there were newspaper clippings, I'm sure, and accounts of things like that too. So his children could read both sides of an issue. Yes?
What's that room called that had 2,000 books around the perimeter?
That's the Memorial Library. If you go to the Garfield site today, this is part of your tour. You get to stand in this lovely room and get to hear about it from one of the guides that we have. So you get to spend some time soaking up that wonderful atmosphere that Lucretia created. And then when you go around the corner to the left, you can walk right into that fireproof vault with the concrete walls and Queen Victoria's wreath still there.
How long has he kept those books?
Oh, he kept those books all his life. If you knew James Garfield, you would know he almost always had a book in his hand. So he started reading, according to his mother, when he was 3 years old. He was reading from the Bible with her. And like Lincoln, got a hold of any books that he could, and when he was a younger boy, these adventure stories were the ones that he enjoyed so much, stories about pirates and ships and adventures and things. In fact, he thought he was going to be a sailor when he grew up after reading those books. So he had books starting at a young age. Whenever he traveled, he purchased books. When he was in Washington as a congressman, he would frequently use the Library of Congress, or the Congressional Library as it was called then. In fact, Mr. Spofford, who was the librarian there, the head librarian, said that James Garfield and one other congressman are the two that took the most books out of that library. So he not only had his own that he purchased, but also a lover of books in general.
Heard he'd like to read books on economics?
Oh, economics, that's one of the big topics, yes. In fact, the trip to the Addams family house in 1869 was about creating a census for the United States. And he was meeting with several men talking about economics, and he understood that about this country. He had stayed at Mr. Chase's house during the Civil War in between battles and assignments, and learned about the country's economics at the feet of our Secretary of the Treasury at the time. Yes, economics. Can you imagine? My head hurts just mentioning the word, but James Garfield was a Renaissance man, I think you could say, because he loved not only Edgar Allan Poe's spooky stories, he loved Jane Austen novels and things by Charles Dickens, but he also had books on economics, religion, languages,
Science. Math.
science.
Okay, the whole range then.
Yes, you name it.
Right.
It was contained in this room, and the books are still there, by the way, folks. The papers are not in the vault, but the books are there. And the books are in almost every room of the house. I think maybe the dining room is the only room without them, but he brought books to that room too, and had spelling bees with his children over the dinner hour. So books were a part of this family's life. Yes, sir.
The name of the individual that assassinated President Garfield, and what motivated him to do that?
We could do maybe 2 programs on that topic, at least a couple of hours. Charles Guiteau is the assassin's name, and he was basically a drifter originally from Freeport, Illinois. He always stayed one step ahead of his bills at his boarding houses. He studied the law, tried to be a lawyer, wasn't good at it. He did a number of occupations that he wasn't very good at. And he got himself aligned with one part of the Republican Party, the stalwarts. Back in James Garfield's era, the Republican Party was very fractured. It was split into 2 main parts. The stalwarts that wanted former President Grant to have a 3rd term, and the half-breeds, which was generally led by James Blaine, and James Garfield was a part of that side. Well, Charles Guiteau wrote a pamphlet, stood on street corners in New York, and was giving speeches for Grant, except that Grant didn't win the nomination at the Republican convention. James Garfield won the nomination after 36 ballots, still a record at Republican conventions. So now Guiteau strikes out Grant's name, puts Garfield's name in there, and gives a really half-hearted, terrible speech. But he thinks when Garfield gets elected, he helped him. He helped him achieve the highest office in the land. So now Guiteau thinks he is deserving of a job. And he travels from New York to Washington, D.C. and starts showing up at the White House, wanting a job within the diplomatic corps. Not the least bit qualified. He wasn't good at much of anything. Finally, after several attempts, the Secretary of State told him, "Go home, never come back here again. You're not qualified, you're not going to get the job." Guiteau had delusions that he was going to get some fine position in Vienna or Paris and live in a fancy mansion and maybe marry a very wealthy lady. But that was not going to happen. So after he was rebuffed, he went back to his boarding house. He said that God spoke to him and told him that if he removed the president, President Garfield, the country would be better off and the Republican Party would be better off with Chester Arthur as its leader. Chester Arthur was James Garfield's vice president and aligned with the stalwarts. So he stalked the president for a number of weeks and finally shot him on July 2nd, 1881, in a train station in Washington. That is a quick synopsis of that. There's so much involved in that story. It's fascinating, and there's a number of books that deal with that. There's a book called Dark Horse by Kenneth Ackerman that goes through the political aspects of James Garfield's presidency and assassination. There's a book by Candace Millard called The Murder of the President. Actually, hers is Destiny of the Republic. Destiny of the Republic. The documentary is called Murder of the President. That's based on that book. So there's several very good books that will take you through the machinations of that assassination and the reasoning behind it.
Yeah, how did James A. Garfield die? Got assassinated?
He got assassinated. He was shot July 2nd, only 4 months into his term. He lingered through the summer, mostly at the White House, the Executive Mansion. And then early in September, he and his doctors agreed they would move him up to the New Jersey shore so that the cool sea air might help him revive. But he died at Long Branch, New Jersey on September 19th at 10:35 in the evening.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes?
One of the issues also that I heard is the patronage system they used to have where people would come to the White House and ask the president for a job, you know.
Yes.
And, yeah, I'm sure they still do. But then, you know, eventually he was in favor of the civil service system. And it is where they pick the best qualified people and they interview for the job, not to the president, but to the Civil Service Commission.
You're exactly right, ma'am, and this was one of the things that James Garfield was trying to work on in that brief amount of time he had in his presidency, and he created a test that a civil servant could take, like you say, to prove that he had the experience and could get that job, and that is a very big part of the Guiteau story. Of course, Guiteau wants a job because he helped a political person win. So he's expecting the patronage, the spoils system to work in his favor. Mm-hmm. Yes, Mary?
Can you tell us the difference between the Adams Library that your husband visited in your library or the way you preserved?
The difference, Mary's asking about the difference between the Adams Library and the Garfield Memorial Library. The Adamses have letters and things, but they gave some to institutions and things and within the family. And this room was solely created to hold James Garfield's books and papers and to have the fireproof vault to ensure that the papers continue to exist is a difference than what would have been found at the Adams family homestead. Alan, do you have more that you would add to that about a difference between Adams and, Alan is one of our rangers down the street here at the Garfield site.
I don't know that I could add more to it. I think what happened here was Mrs. Garfield preserved the papers in a room dedicated to them. And no previous presidential family had done such a thing, as you pointed out. The Adamses did not retain the papers of the two Presidents Adams at their home. They were preserved at other institutions, Massachusetts Historical Society, for example. So I think that what's here is a first.
Yes.
Where they are preserved in a room built for them.
Thank you. That sort of underlined the difference right there.
And how about the money? I mean,
The money.
now presidential libraries are funded by the government, but
Yes, the library system nowadays is run by the National Archives, and they give some money to former presidents, but then presidents also raise a lot of money on their own. And the first presidential library in that system was actually FDR's, and then Hoover came after that, even though he was president before FDR. And so everyone from Hoover on has a presidential library courtesy of the National Archives. Now, some of the more modern retiring presidents have done a little bit different kind of thing. Some of them are staying outside the archives. You'll have to look up the Obama library. I think he was toying with creating a separate entity. And of course now, we're talking about the digital world, right? We're talking about emails and digitized documents and things. You know, not something that may be handheld necessarily. These are handheld papers. There's over 400 volumes in the Library of Congress. And Lucretia's papers were sent there as well. So it's a huge collection. Other presidents have dispersed things too. I think Grant's things are down at a university in the South. So they're spread around other places besides that National Archive system that started with Hoover.
And
Kathy?
the National Archives, you can now see those online, right?
I think so.
Garfield papers online.
Oh, thank you. That's great. I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to mention that in addition to the fact that the papers did go to the Library of Congress in the summer of 2019, I believe, they digitized the collection. So all of you can sit at home in your comfortable clothes or your pajamas and you can look up GarfieldPapersLOC.com. And you can see his wonderful handwriting. You can see notes with all the people he rubbed elbows with. An interesting story I heard, when Candace Millard was researching for her book, Destiny of the Republic, she went to the Library of Congress, got a whole assortment of papers and things, and she got an envelope. And she opened it, and the reddish-brown hair trickled out. And she said she was excited and mortified simultaneously because it was snippets of James Garfield's hair. And she swept it back into the envelope, very quickly closed it up, returned it to the librarian. So, as Lucretia was trying to get across earlier, he saved everything. He saved the very first letter he ever wrote to his mother. One of the great ways to learn more about all these kinds of things is to follow the Garfield Site's Facebook page. Ranger Mary has Did You Knows and Museum Mondays, and we always try to have something from Garfield's diaries or writings every day that's pertinent to the day of the month that it happens to be. So you can learn a lot that way too, without still at home, right by your computer, without having to get dressed and travel far. Anything else? You've been a great audience. I appreciate your wonderful, thoughtful questions. Thank you.